Good evening and welcome. This is approximately the sixth course in Fractal University, fractalu.com. This course is focused on the deep science of biologic architecture, understanding the mechanisms of life force in architecture from the point of view of science. Our focus through the years have been to understand what is a bioactive electric field, and we've come to be rather passionate about this idea that if you build a bioactive field, you create something that not only defines sacred space, but determines basically the vitality of your aura and ultimately your survival, your thrival, your ability to take memory through death, all the important stuff. So I think we'll start this conversation about living architecture with what I consider to be important evidence of defining the purpose of architecture. I'm sure that at university, when you discuss the purpose of architecture, they talk about economy of housing and survival needs and access to food, clothing, and shelter and all that kind of stuff, which is fine and appropriate. However, I think there's a higher definition of architectural function, which used to be called spirituality, but I think now that we're much closer to defining spirituality as science, we can define that aspect of architecture, which used to be under spiritual terms, in new scientific language, and that's what I'd like to talk about this evening. I would argue that once you understand what it is that makes your immune system thrive and potentially enables you to take memory through death, gives you access to bliss and peak perception, peak experience, that those things, if they were understood electrically, would comprise a new definition of the function of architecture. As evidenced through the centuries that architecture classically has been in the domain of the sacred. But the sacred, unfortunately, in our time was poorly understood and operates under mythologies instead of physics. And that's what I hope to fix. That we believe that we can now define what kind of structure enables your aura to be healthy. And that enables your immune system, enables your bliss experience, and enables your successful birth and death. And that evidence then sets up the background for what would then define success in architecture. Clearly, the ancients knew that. I mean, the sacred temple in ancient times was always something of a spiritual place where you had a certain quality of feeling, which is obviously almost entirely lost in most modern metal synthetic buildings. So how we generate that quality of sacred space and feeling is essential to understanding the purpose of architecture and therefore success in architecture. I believe that Dr. Korotkov's work in measuring, first of all, where the Kogis went to make phone calls to their ancestors, but ultimately defining that as sacred space sets up a very good foundation for understanding what architecture is for. So in summary, what Professor Korotkov did was he took this, I'm going to just make the screen smaller and use that picture now. One moment, I've lost my screen. One moment here. Just one moment here, bear with me. Hopefully I'm back with you. We had a little glitch there. Stop sharing your microphone, your webcam. Okay. What I wanted to talk about was how Professor Korotkov measured success with the Kogi process of where they went not just for sacred space and ritual, but for making phone calls to their ancestors. And basically what he measured was this, that the capacitance of that space was what we call charge distribution efficient. In other words, here, Dr. Korotkov is measuring the capacitance of the air in the sacred space and comparing that to the air in a space which was the opposite of sacred, in a metal building, very dead air, dead space. And it turns out that consistently in the place where the shaman are able to make phone calls to their ancestors and to have that communication with sacred space and with the divine, as it were, to feel embedded and highly intuitive, access to peak experience, that the quality of the air in that space had a very particular quality called charge distribution efficiency. Now, these are measures that I made, but it shows the principle. This is Korotkov's device, the GDV, gas discharge visualization. And here you see that the ability of a spark to be propagated efficiently defined sacred space, and therefore where you could have successful communication with ancestors. And presumably, that's what we want to get to, is presumably have access to successful death. And that may sound like an oxymoron, but that's what I'd like to talk about. The other thing that Professor Korotkov measured was the activity of the ghost after death, where the spirit goes after death. And there's a famous slide about that. Maybe we'll bring that up later. But essentially what he showed was that the same device, which is measuring the Kirlian fingerprints, would clearly indicate at what time after death the aura, the charge envelope, the ka, your boat into the underworld, or your ghost, at what point does that leave the body? And sure enough, at about 3 and 10 hours after death, consistently, the plasma spirit body, the ghost, leaves the body. And that's measurable by measuring this collapse of the cold plasma field around the body, your aura. And that's a bubble of charge. And that bubble of charge, which we think was called the ka in Egypt, your boat into the underworld, has certain needs. And those needs are instructive for biologic architecture. One of the things that Korotkov showed was that the plasma ghost, and he measured it with infrared and ultraviolet, which is classic for the ghost hunters technology, which is very sophisticated technology these days, that it goes to the place in the room which achieves charge compression. And I'm using this slide here to illustrate that. What Carlos Castaneda called the place of power in a room, he said, whenever you go into a room, you locate your place of power, and thus you achieve embedding, and you get leverage over that space. Similar as we're going to be talking about in our upcoming conference on embedding in space shamanically, 7arrows.net, with Sarah, where if you visualize those 7 spins of the tetracube accurately in a sequence, it's like you're nesting yourselves in the tornadoes, the vortex, the electric field, the domain, in the sense of dominus vobiscum, the electric domain of the room. And you're embedding in the space, and therefore you're taking control of the space. In a sense, you can steer the tornadoes in that area over which you have embedded your spin. Now, this is instructive because what Korotkov found was the ghost needs to go to the place in the room where charge compression becomes charge acceleration, which is my language for saying that the ghost is a plasma bubble that needs to achieve something. It needs to achieve implosive charge distribution that then embeds your spin into the environment, hopefully in a way that makes that sustainable. You become part of ancestor memory. You become part of the communion of saints. You become, well, when the Tibetans die, you see the dramatic, it was advanced Tibetan dies, you see this dramatic appearance on the films of rainbows. And we know the physics pretty much that the increase of phase conjugate centripetal force of charge in an environment is the cause of rainbows. And we're going to explain that physics perhaps later. But the point is that by increasing the centripetal force electrically of the environment, the ghost, the spirit, the saint has served that environment by increasing the negentropy of that field. But further, that we know that if you look at the sequence of visions held by the near-death experiencers, something called the Heinrich Clouvet form constants, and let's see, all those visions images are at goldenmean.info/immortality. So this conversation has the pictures at goldenmean.info/immortality, this couple minutes here. So the Clouvet form constants is said to be a map of death, but it's a lattice cobweb tunnel spiral. It's the geometric sequence consistently and repeatedly seen by near-death experiences. And by analyzing that, we saw that that effectively was simply the sequence of braids, recursive braid embedding happening in DNA, for example, which enables charge compression to superpose axes of spin symmetry. Quite literally going to the next dimension, but in this case, it specifically states what going to the next dimension is, which is superposing the next axis of spin symmetry in a rotating charge body, which is to say a rotating plasma body. So in my view, you know, the very common idea about, well, we're going to go to the next dimension, it gets to be something of a new age concept, but it should actually be discussed in a very rigorous electrical context, that the DNA, for example, takes a tetracube, rotates that into a dodeca, and then rotates that dodeca down a helix, which is what DNA is. And so it's each time it's superposing an axis of spin symmetry, which is to say go to the next dimension. And that would allow another harmonic to show up in a frequency signature of that electric field, in this case your DNA, which is said to be what they meant by boson 7 at Montauk, or microchloridians in the blood in the Star Wars series, which indicates whether your DNA is implosive, light bending, and psychokinetic. Quite literally, is your DNA imploding? Do you have a soul? All of that directly relates to this idea, can you superpose another axis of spin of charge in that electric field? Which is why we say if the tetracube is 3 axes of spin and the dodeca is 4, and you ratchet step the dodecahedron down a helix, that accurately maps DNA, and that's a thread of DNA, and that's 5 axes of spin superposed. But then if you take that thread of DNA and you braid it recursively, and then you braid the braid on the braid of the braid on the braid of the braid, you know, the thread becomes string, becomes rope, becomes fat rope, until you did that 7 times, and then that DNA actually measurably becomes toroidal. It turns inside out, it implodes. And you have 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, and you probably recognize that metaphor from the Anu, which is also the symmetry of the human heart structure, and basically a map to implosion, which in my view is how you get a soul. Now, which is to say how you get a consistent thread connected to the superluminal faster than light, which is longitudinal wave creation within your DNA, which we now know is the physics of flame in the mind, and how you become psychokinetic, and how you can light a fire at your distance, and how you can, come on baby, light my fire, and all this stuff. It's really about this access to this superposed spin symmetry, recursion, embedding, charge implosion. So go there to that, in this case right here, where these spirals implode. And metaphorically, this would be where the place in the room from which you would be most likely to be able to make an echo. And more than metaphorically, capacitively, then if you were to measure the capacitance of that spot, and we demonstrate that at, here I'll type in the link at goldenmean.info/biophoton. If you were to measure the charge of that spot with a sensitive volt transducer like hemp fibers attached to a high impedance scope probe, when you dump that into a microvolt spectrum analyzer, which is what a brainwave spectrum analyzer is, which is what we use to do those measures. The harmonic inclusiveness, which would indicate whether that space was sacred, and that harmonic inclusiveness is functionally equivalent to what Korotkov measured. Basically, efficient resonance. So the place where an echo would happen is also potentially, if the electrical geometry is more than metaphor for the acoustic geometry, that the charge field also has an echo to recursion implosion at the same spot. The perfect echo is more than just acoustics. The perfect echo is the climax of the Sufi movie Meetings with Remarkable Men, where the holy man is assigned his status based on his skill to know where and how to make an echo. Because if you can make the perfect echo, you're actually setting up the standing wave, which is more than metaphor for access to the immortal, to the sustainable. And the echo is more than just acoustic. It is capacitive, it's magnetic, it's perfect recursion, it's perfect embedding, it's perfect implosion. So, we didn't really want, perhaps, to have a sort of esoteric philosophy as an underpinning for introducing biologic architecture. But there's a reason to have this conversation, which is because if you understand essentially biologically what people are for, in the sense of Kurt Vonnegut, Breakfast of Champions, sitting at the bar at breakfast time, discovering that whiskey was the breakfast of champions, and the key question he asked was, what are people for? And you say, well, we'll have to check with a religion for that. I say, no, religion is just an introduction to good physics. And good physics says that human beings make something which is potentially immortal. The bubble of capacitive charge around their body, your aura, your ka, your boat into the underworld. And not only does that determine whether you take memory through death and thus become immortal, all of which is seemingly quite measurable, but also it determines whether you have an immune system and whether you thrive. So effectively, I believe, and biologically, I think the case could be made that the purpose of people is to make a coherent aura, because that's what makes them thrive as people and what gives them an immune system and what makes them immortal. Now, all of which is saying basically the same thing as every religion in history has ever said, except the new thing we're doing is we're saying that exclusively with electrical engineering language, thanks to Korotkov and some of our work. So, if you know what people are for, then you can invent architecture. If you know what a bioactive field is, then you can discover what architecture was designed to do, which is clearly what the ancients were doing, which unfortunately has been totally forgotten. I mean, in effect, again, using the fun story of our friend Sam Osmanagic, Bosnian pyramids, who discovered after the whole country of Bosnia now recognize how important he is, because 500,000 tourists are coming there per year to get rejuvenated. And specifically, he is scientifically documenting the rejuvenation effect. And so suddenly the function of a pyramid is to rejuvenate people, and we have the science. Witness Sam Osmanagic, who just ordered Therify.net for that reason, because he discovered that the combination of the infrasound, the low frequency sonics underneath, which harmonic series we now know, the Schumann harmonic cascade, is precisely a phase conjugate implosive pump wave, which does the plasma compression, which creates the orbs and enables negative ion wind, which is profoundly healing and rejuvenating. That's well documented. And the negative ion count underneath the Bosnia pyramid is off the charts. These negative ions are little black holes, and they're extremely fragile, and they only exist in an electrically implosive environment. And by the way, that is the perfect place for plasma rejuvenation, which is why Sam has just ordered a Therify. It's pretty cool. And on top of that, the wall structure, these layers, you had the muscovite and the quartz or calcite piezo sand, and then you had the clay, which was the alternate layers of high dielectric, which meant that now you have what's effectively a phase conjugate dielectric with a phase conjugate negentropic pump wave infrasound down below. And what do you have? A very implosive field effect, which is then a bioactive field. Now, we have tried to summarize all the ways in which bioactivefield.com is made commercial at bioactivefield.com. We have bioactive cement, bioactive glass, bioactive water, bioactive plasma. And it's all based on this one simple idea that if you cause the field, the charge, the symmetry, the wave symmetry to be phase conjugate, negentropic, and implosive, you create growth effect, you create bioactivity, which is, I've kind of dedicated my life to that concept, to saying what is a bioactive field. So when I try to introduce a biologic architecture, I obviously am not introducing architecture from the point of view of an economist or a cultural historian. I am introducing biologic architecture from a new conviction of what a bioactive field is, and with the conviction that if the field is bioactive, then the architecture is serving the purpose of increasing vitality, increasing life, and increasing, in fact, immortality, which is why our fundamental joke at where we have our biologic architecture curriculum, which, as you well know, our biologic architecture curriculum in general, and we have this taught in many countries, is at goldenmean.info/architecture. But our little joke there has always been that after your architect builds your house, we specify 3 ways to measure whether, in fact, the house will cause a seed to grow. You can actually measure seed germination percentages by comparison. You can measure it capacitively in the biophoton technique, and of course you can use the corrective technique. There are many ways to measure whether, in fact, you've made an electric field that causes a seed to grow. I am convinced that steel and aluminum buildings will measurably prevent seeds from growing immediately and measurably. So our little joke was you determine whether the architect gets a paycheck after you determine whether the electric field of the building causes seeds to grow or to die. I think that's a fundamental insight which should require reinventing every architecture school on planet Earth. We told the story of, the ancients. I've told the story many times. They said, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. And what they meant was, I will raise a bioactive field that will prevent aging and rejuvenate. The word Shem was translated to mean altar in the church, although Sitchin called it Highward Firestone. We now know that means literally electrical access to a black hole, or functionally an implosive capacitance. That's what a Shem unto the Lord is, and that's what an altar in a church must be if it's actually going to be an altar. And in my view, only electrical engineers are fundamentally competent, therefore, to design altars in churches. I guess electrical engineers have the same prejudice as every profession, that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Well, for electrical engineering, the only tool we have is electric fields that make life, and therefore, so we electrical engineers have a prejudice about this. But in fact, it's the only way we could know what spirituality is, in my view, is to describe it with rigor, which obviously is the language of science. So that's the introductory piece, which says, now that we know what buildings are supposed to do, we can invent buildings. And this is where we get into examples from several of the architects we've been working with. The series of examples we're going to use tonight is Michael Rice, bioarchitecture.ie, and he has another website now, who eventually he's going to be doing some courses with us. And so Michael Rice actually took this drawing on the right here. We had the 510 and the 612 spiral symmetry, and he designed buildings around that and did some amazing work designing buildings intuitively using this sacred geometry. And so Michael Rice has taught at all of our international conferences. We've had international conferences on the core curriculum of biologic architecture in, of course, Prague. And the big one we had was in Mexico City, and we had one in Cardiff. And actually, we're going to show some pictures of those events. And the main teachers at all those events were Michael Rice, myself, and Ulrich Hausmann, arc.cz. And he's the other one we're going to show some examples of later. But first we're starting with Michael Rice. So the other thing that Michael Rice came to in biological architecture was that spheres are bad, eggs are good. And this is, if you allow me to poke fun for a moment, we have the Buckminster Fuller Institute, who are sort of similarly blind to one critical idea, as was Bucky himself, whom I worked with for many years. That Bucky and John Denver installed, I told this story before, but Bucky and John Denver installed the metal geodesic sphere at our community in Waynesville, North Carolina, Circle of Life. And it was clearly the most deathly, most insidiously destructive, and immediately would kill almost any plant life that I've ever been inside of. And this is the pride of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Do you see the idiocy of this? I've been trying to tell those guys for years, but what is it about a metal sphere that's opposite to life? Well, first of all, the capacitance of that Buckminster Fuller sphere is harmonically exclusive capacity, which means that if you took a spectrum analysis of its electric field, its capacitive field, you'd find harmonic exclusiveness, that there'd only be a few harmonics in there, very isolated, which is to say it's a charge isolator. So Mother Nature does not use spheres for very much. Generally, for example, your eyeballs, yes, but in general, most of the cells in your body, or almost all of them, if they get to be spherical, you suspect cancer. The reason is because a sphere is a charge isolator, because you can see it. If you take this egg shape in front of you here, the egg shape creates charge projection at one end. And that charge projection is how it shares its electric field with its environment, how it embeds, how it becomes polar. If you can measure pine cones and chicken eggs, and you take a high impedance voltmeter, particularly on a chicken egg, you can get 5 to 12 millivolts end to end, which is basically the measurement of a life or death in that egg, which is to say, is it imploding capacitance? Is it extracting voltage from its environment? Is it cohering the vacuum? Is it getting zero-point energy? And that defines life. Now, if that egg were a sphere, it would not extract any voltage from environment. It would not achieve embedding. It'd be a charge isolator. In fact, in Vortex of Life, Fields of Form by Lawrence Edwards, highly recommended in the anthroposophic biodynamic tradition, in that book, he goes to extensive work to show the slight change in angle of the alignment of the seeds on the surface of the pine cone, which allows the pine cone to modulate how much voltage it's getting from gravity. All of which is to say, egg-shaped, pine cone-shaped, yes, and spheres, no. So spheres are not healthy for architecture because they prevent capacitance from being distributed. The name of that book was called Vortex of Life, Fields of Form. Originally it was called Fields of Form. It was called Vortex of Life, Fields of Form by Lawrence Edwards. I think it's L-A-W by Edwards. It's the core text of biodynamics and anthroposophic literature, any Steiner library, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very elaborate drawings in there where they watch a pine cone over the course of a year, and when the pine cone needs more electric power, I mean, it's just like the automatic electric meter in your house determining when do you need more voltage. Oh, okay, let's rearrange the seeds on the surface of this pine cone, and we will modulate the amount of voltage we're getting from gravity. Ha! You might not even need Elon Musk's wall of power if you knew how to cohere the vacuum like a pine cone does. And how do you adjust the power input? You simply slightly rearrange the seeds on the surface of the capacitor called a pine cone to be more or less implosive, and therefore adjust your power levels. This is nature at work. So this, pine cone design is ultimately, in my view, instruction in how to be a biologic architecture. And that book would be essential. Incidentally, in this particular egg-shaped room made of biologic material with Michael Rice there at his original place in Ireland, and I think his children here are much grown right now. Actually, I should say that looking at this picture could make us feel a bit old. But anyway, the story was that even the workmen who were bringing material to help build these structures, when they got into this egg, they just never wanted to leave. Everybody gets in there, they feel so good, they never want to go. Well, the reason they felt so good is because it's a perfect biologic capacitor. And you see how he has the implicit golden spiral in the window here. Isn't that great? That the actual reflection in the window completes the golden spiral of the design. That was so. This is credit to Michael Rice. Okay. So again, eggs and not pine cones. In this case, this was actually an optometrist's office. This is a top-down view of a new office for an eye doctor. And what does it look like? An eyeball. What is it doing? It's achieving conjugate focus. In fact, the way Michael always would, he would start with his new clients in biologic architecture, and he would come in and he would have them talk about what their new building, what they were passionate about in their building. And then they would spontaneously together make a sketch of what symbolized their dream. Like in one case it was a football, in another case it was a baby, whatever it was. And that actually was a plan for the geometry of the building. In this case, an eyeball for an optometrist's office. I think this is the ground floor. So getting it in focus was actually getting a building that was actually the morphic resonance to the dream. Now this was to be a healing center in Sligo in Ireland, and the point to be made here was that it actually was representing this perfect pine cone, perfect recursion, that the sacred space here is the implosion space, the place of power, the place of plasma implosion. Because you see, what's happening at the sacred space, the place from which you'd have the perfect echo, you could call it the heart of the matter or the perfect Valentine here. But actually what's happening in physics is that the wave propagation velocities are adding and multiplying recursively by golden mean ratio here. And this form of charge compression is turning that compression into acceleration at center, which is, say, the rotational component is becoming a linear component, or more accurately, which is, say, converting matter to energy, but more accurately, that the transverse component was here becoming a longitudinal component, which is to say, being coherently accelerated through the speed of light down into that infinite tunnel of Dodeca, the perfect superconductor. And in that is DNA radio. In that is the collective unconscious. In that is the communion of saints. And that's where biologic communication is made possible. That's perfect embedding. And that's sacred space. And that's what the building needs to make that kind of charge. Call it phase conjugate dielectrics, phase conjugate magnetics, metaphor for phase conjugate optics. We talked about this slide. Yeah, so this was the top-down view here from, I mean, this was the 3D view of the design for that space. But you see how the actual center actually has an open quality, but the sacred space, the charge embedding space, is under the cupola here, which could be a metaphor for a kiva or stupa. You'll see pictures of that. And now we've often talked about these designs in ancient structures like Atlantis and the city of Amsterdam, which uses alternate layers of water and land. And Atlantis, called Thule, we know now it comes from the Aboriginal term atlatl, which means projectile or projector. And we know exactly what was happening, that if you alternate the layers of water and land correctly, you create the form of capacitance, which is implosive, and thus bioactive, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we always loved the fact that this was a pent shape, pent shape recursive embedding. But if you talk to the Dutch historian here, he will assure you that the reason this fort town was pent shaped was strictly the military advantage of the angles for the placement of the guns. However, we would say that the pent, in the sense of repent and be saved, here was in fact also related to the ability to implosively, by pent-golden ratio, attract capacitance. And you might make that case even by looking here at the picture, well, it looks like you have a lot of growth force in the center. Looks like the green is actually growing there. So, but these are examples from history. Certainly, if Thule, the name for Atlantis, and Thule is Tehute, Thoth, Hermes, which is the Hermetic life force scientist in whose footsteps we walk, and whose symbol, the caduceus, in modern physics is called phase conjugation. So this is the Hermetic principle embodied, hopefully. So now we're going to talk about the stupa a little bit here. We had a discouraging experience once. I think it was in Australia where they were building modern stupas, and unfortunately, we went into this modern stupa, and it felt really bad. And it turns out that they reinforced the concrete, the cement, with steel, and that it was located very close to a power transformer. Obviously, these people had sort of missed the physics. This is a case where just tradition is not good enough. You need the physics to know how to build sacred space. This is my humble opinion. So, but the ancient stupa used a living cement, which is biologic capacitance, and it used no metal. Clearly, they didn't have steel and aluminum in those days, thank goodness. This is why I say we must update ancient feng shui. We must update the Chinese version of ancient feng shui using physics, because in those days, they didn't have steel and aluminum and electrosmog and dead air. If they did, the feng shui teacher would have had to know that this was death to life force. So a stupa actually, here, this would be a convex capacitor of high dielectric biologic materials, carefully eliminating all metal, things that would destroy the dielectric, at least eliminating the steel and aluminum. And then these layers were actually real gold, alternate gold rings. And if you understood what this is doing in terms of increasing the voltage of the capacitance, this thing is practically a Tesla coil waiting to happen. So improperly done, the stupa is basically a genius invention from Tesla to make a seed grow. But again, you'd need to know the electrical engineering to know what a stupa is for. And once you do, the tradition becomes physics. We're not saying to discard the tradition, but I'm saying the tradition is only empowered and actually ultimately discriminates if you can do the physics. Next slide. So here we have as a result of these conversations about biologic materials, we came up with a basic chart. And I think here we should explain a little bit that what is the reason from an electrical engineering viewpoint of why biologic materials are necessary for architecture. We're saying the fundamental concept is the capacitance of your aura must be able to breathe, which is to say resonate efficiently. It's like the day Bob Beck showed us a little bit about the physics of bliss. He took a pen, I think it was a 10-cent Bic pen. He rubbed it in his dry hair, which mine is quite dry right now, and so that he got a little bit of static electricity on the tip of that pen, and then he waved that pen in the air at around 8 hertz. So he basically got millivolts of charge, and he's entraining the whole room at 8 hertz. And I swear it was quite literally true. A wave of euphoria went through that room. Now later we learned to do this with a 2-cent piece of aluminum foil at the ceiling and the floor, and a millivolt or very low voltage signal and a complex wave of 8 hertz. And by the way, now we would know how to do this with the correct whole phase conjugate implosive cascade of the Schumann resonance complex harmonic series, which is on the cover of my book, and induce euphoria in a room. Now the point is that this is much less possible if this room is filled with metal surfaces, steel and aluminum, and dead air and electrosmog. It doesn't work very good. Whereas the room is capacitively charged and ringing and just ready for an oscillator at the center to tune it, suddenly that is a bliss environment waiting to happen. Hence the Bosnian pyramid, hence why the ancients called the pyramids the hummer, because the infrasound was the pump wave and causing it to hum. And the perfect hum was implosive and conjugate and fractal and self-aware and negentropic. So every molecule that wishes to join that fun electric club called life. They were walking around town and looking for the best club in town, and they saw, oh, there's a club over there, living stuff. Ooh, we would like to go into that club. And the molecule gets to the door of the club, and the officer at the door says, you can come in here only if you get fractal or you get dead, which is to say, they need to rearrange their key molecular bonds to be more conjugate and fractal to achieve charge distribution efficiency. And then you can come into the exclusive club, life. So in practice, this means that the best water molecules are clathrate at dodeca geometry. The best superconductive atoms for conjugate fields, Buckminster fullerene, again, dodecaecosa. The most living molecule for biology is the dodeca ratchet called DNA. So phase conjugate implosive structures become life. And molecular bonds that don't embed in phase conjugate fractality don't get to join the club. So then, a couple thousand years later, however long it is, every molecule that was once part of life is much more likely to have had its molecular structure rearranged to be more charge distribution efficient, which is to say fractal, which is to say our favorite model. This is the fullerene, this is the clathrate case, this is the geometry of hydrogen, this is the geometry of the DNA ratchet, the geometry of light, perfect embedding, the only 3D fractal. goldenmean.info/grail is the animation. So, how does an electrical engineer talk about this when he specifies the materials necessary for biologic architecture? I believe in general that high dielectric constant is a criteria which is useful in describing materials useful for architecture. Specifically, think about your aura. It needs to ring like a bell so that it can propagate its field, its charge, its domain, its dominus vobiscum. And for capacitance to propagate efficiently, it is obvious to electrical engineers that the dielectric constant is the key. So if a material has high dielectric, then it rings like a bell better, and therefore it's better for architecture. And biologic materials are more likely to have high dielectric constant. This is something which, if the Wilhelm Reich orgone designers had understood, they could use electrical engineering terms perfectly to describe what is orgone. Unfortunately, they're very resistant to using any other term than orgone because it would make that whole science available to the scientific community instead of exclusive to those who want to use a schizophrenic language. To think that orgone is somehow separate from physics, that's a schizophrenia, which I find objectionable. So, what is a dielectric constant? The dielectric refers to the quality of the insulation material from the two conductive plates of a capacitor. If the dielectric is high in the capacitor, then if you hit it with a voltage, it will ring like a bell. And you measure how efficiently the bell rings when you hit it with a hammer called voltage, and that's called the dielectric constant, the efficiency of the ringing of capacitance. How efficiently will the bell ring? Sounds a little bit like making a good echo, doesn't it? So, effectively, if you've done your experiment, and we have pictures later on in the show, actually, we're at slide number 14, and those pictures, the experiment I'm referring to is where you place seeds inside metal. Here's one of those pictures, yes. So these seeds on the right were placed in a metal container, and these seeds on the left were placed in an orgone accumulator, which we now know is a phase conjugate high dielectric, implosive capacitance. And that's a difference in seed growth. Now we achieve something perhaps even more dramatic than that with the imploder and with purify.com, which are implosive capacitors. And the purify.com capacitors look like this. So basically you have a gold film, which is making a very efficient implosive capacitance, and then you have a ceramic, which if it's done right with a high dielectric constant, the right trace mineral like ceramic, etc. So, and you can tell something that has good dielectric because it feels good, which is to say, you know how if you feel something that has a good dielectric, it could become your pet rock. Well, when you pick up a rock and decide which rock you want to be your pet rock, it's one that you can feel. When you can feel it, this means that it's reflecting your capacitance efficiently. Whereas if you picked up a piece of aluminum, you would immediately feel the capacitance your figure go completely dead and numb, and it almost takes the feeling right out of your hand to hold aluminum. You obviously are not going to make a piece of aluminum into your pet rock because it's the opposite of feeling. What is the opposite of feeling? Feeling is charge distribution efficiency. The aluminum is charge distribution is the opposite of charge distribution efficiency. It's because the charge is isolated in the aluminum and can't distribute, which is if you put your seeds in an aluminum cup and watch them die, and then put your seeds in this cup and watch them grow, to make a measurement to predict which is which, if you put your hemp fibers, for example, in here on your scope probe and spectrum analyze it, I'm feeling a little tingle in my finger right now. It's a negative ion wind. It's a little bit of sacred space here. I do it to my crown chakra. Ooh, I can feel it. Actually, it's accelerating my metabolism. I can feel my kundalini wiggling, and it can be a bit dizzying, actually. But it's imploding the capacitance. Now, if you put your spectrum analyzer in the center of this, you would find harmonic inclusiveness because the curvature is non-spherical, it's egg-shaped, it's an implosive cascade. So you'd find harmonic inclusiveness, which is leading toward phase conjugation implosion, and that equals charge distribution efficiency because out the center of the implosion you have perfected charge distribution. Now, if you put the same little capacitive transducer, in the case of the Callahan probe, if you put the hemp fibers dipped in sea salt or living human sweat, inside a steel or aluminum cup, you would find harmonic exclusiveness. And that is what prevents the seed from growing because it prevents the charge from being well distributed. Wayne says there are great echo chambers, dielectric stone and soils in Canyon due to hard to find. Well, with the hike with my guitar. Eden says, what is the effect with more neutral metals like titanium, niobium, or tungsten? Good question. Okay, for that question, let's go back to the slide we were at before. We didn't finish with our chart of materials, and that's where we were going with this, was a chart of living materials. Slide number 14. Okay. So, the difference between metals. So what we're saying is that dielectric constant and the ability to make a capacitor which is high harmonic inclusive will determine which material creates a living capacitor versus a dead capacitor, and therefore life or death to building design. So let's translate that into practicality. With this chart, work of biology is to get molecules arranged in a fractal, accomplish this perfected charge distribution of charge called life. This relative fractality, self-similarity in the charge field, allows us to find which building materials can fabricate a structure which causes life, seed growth, germination, and bliss. Okay, that's the point here. Now, if we apply this to metals and the question from Eden, high on this list here, at the top are materials that are excellent for life force making and therefore biology and therefore architecture. And at the bottom of this list are materials that are poisonous to life force making and therefore architecture. So at the top you see gold. And gold here, a thin film of gold is very excellent at capacitive harmonic inclusiveness, very excellent at conjugate, and layered with the proper material could make a phase conjugate dielectric. To answer your question, also, actually, classically, titanium is well known among advanced geobiologists for very specific functions. For example, a titanium pipe was supposedly like orgone heaven for focusing a ley line into cloud busting and all that kind of stuff. Titanium has very useful applications to geobiology and advanced geobiology. I'll give you a link. It's Stefan Cardio, genie.ch, goldenmean.info/geobiology. There you will find an actual slide of Stefan Cardino's measurements of Hartmann-Curry-Peiwei-Palm line, discriminated by which metal most effectively deflects which of the geobiological lines. And he also has a chart of which frequencies most deflect. For example, the Hartmann and the Curry line are often pathologic, particularly if they go in straight lines too long, you know. But the lines that are wonderful for life, the Peiwei line, could save the life of a beehive, for example, P-E-Y-R-E, the Peiwei line. You'll see the pictures there. The Peiwei line cross is a beautiful place to save the life of a beehive, etc. And the Peiwei line is most deflected by gold. So there's a lot to geobiology. There's actually frequency signatures to the various energy lines. This course doesn't have the time to go into advanced geobiology, and we have some of that material at our geobiology link, but Stefan Cardino's school in Switzerland is highly recommended for its advanced geobiology students, and in fact, our close friend Lydia from Athens, who's doing geopathic line measurement technologies with Professor Stavros, just came from the courses with Stefan in Lausanne, outside of Geneva, and it was absolutely ecstatic with the information there. Stefan is famous because, for among other things, his Kundalini awakening from having an axial tilt adjust triggered extreme clairvoyance, and now he can see all these energy lines and is very adept at advanced geobiology and can even diagnose ancient architecture underground structures by seeing the energy lines clairvoyantly. And we've recommended his services to Sam in Bosnia. At any rate, so back to our chart here. So what we're saying is the material then in the other columns here, the woods, the stones, and the fabrics, the materials at the top are most fractal, and in most cases are higher dielectric constant, and make fabulous capacitance for biologic architecture. For example, in fabrics, hemp fiber is literally the stuff of which the Callahan probe was made for measuring sensitive geobiology, for example, measuring whether a tree is alive or dead by its capacitance. You can see that all at goldenmean.info/biophoton. So the most useful fabrics, hemp, silk, cotton, and wool, in many cases unbleached or unheated, are best, of course. The capacitance still alive. And the worst, bad news, of course, would be polyester. This would immediately deplete the capacitance of your body and therefore be bad for architecture and clothing. And our discussion, we use that as an intro to our project on bioactive field clothing at fractalclothing.net. And the parallel site on our bioactive field cement is fractalfield.com/living cement. I'm putting these links in here, all at bioactivefield.com as well. And the living cement then moves us over to the next column, the stones, and the concept of the ancient geopolymer, what we were talking about with Dr. Sam Osmanagic there from the Bosnian pyramids, that not only were those ancient geopolymers, the stone powders, mixed with the correct dielectrics, was something like 6 to 8 times stronger than concrete, but they made a form of capacitance which was bioactive, conjugate, high dielectric. He talked about layers of muscovite, piezo rock powder, calcite quartz, and of course the clay. And this relates to the conversation about shungite, which is also a phase conjugate dielectric. Professor Korotkov for a long time had his own website on shungite, very healing. And shungite embedded in glass crystals was originally Nick Nolte's water treatment device, which then later he embedded them in plastic. But the capacitance of the shungite would be parallel to, for example, the grander water technique. Again, it's a capacitive radiance. Wayne says, would granite dust or ceramic added to the paint be good for the interiors of structures? Paint is a very good question. We believe that, for example, a copper and copper titanates are wonderful for inhibiting electrosmog in paint. And high dielectric and high capacitance rock powders could make a structure very capacitive and resonant in a paint, which would tend to amplify any electric fields there, which if they were, of course, like in the pyramid, if the Schumann harmonics were present, then that would be wonderful. However, if there was lots of electrosmog in that building, then adding capacitance to the paint might be amplifying the bad instead of the good. But in general, a high dielectric paint is useful. And by the way, a titanates in the paint is a classic introduction to phase conjugate dielectrics, which are the super high dielectrics, the magic stuff. And barium titanate is how you start your course on phase conjugate dielectrics, barium titanate. And if you Google Alice in barium titanate land, I'm typing this in for fun, barium titanate land, if you Google that, you get the paper about how the electric field made by phase conjugate dielectrics appears to be self-aware. They find each other at a distance. This is like little glowing plasma bulbs of life force mindfulness that get launched by implosive capacitance. Think of them as orbs. And they seem to know how to find each other at a distance in a manner which is like self-aware, similar to the way George Edgley in Budapest so well documents that ball lightning is so very susceptible to telepathy. So all of these implosive plasma ball kind of things, barium titanate and phase conjugate dielectrics, are an introduction to how conjugate charge fields, conjugate charge bubbles, implosive charge bubbles, orbs, little toroids, which are like ball lightning, why they are so close to DNA radio. What is this about self-awareness and ability to self-refer and charge implosion and phase conjugation? It all has to do with the same stuff. And while we're on the question of superconjugators, we need to mention Star Trek. We know that when Scotty in Star Trek, he first used the impulse power. Impulse power is when you, for thrust, impulse power is when you pump the magnetic flux in the accurate spiral on the torus, otherwise known as the Vimana or the Nazi bell, that if you get enough magnetic and hydrodynamic inertia on the accurate spiral and you pump that with high enough inertia, you make lift. That's called impulse power. But the more esoteric form of propulsion, which is what you need to do with your plasma when you die if you're good, and how Keshe makes lift by rotating conjugators called GANs or the cold plasma. A rotating conjugator creates propulsion because warp power is imploding lithium niobate. they call it the dilithium crystal, but the actual correct term is lithium niobate, which is a phase conjugate, high implosive dielectric. And like the quartz cube in the Koski-Frost experiments, where you put a phase conjugate pump wave, just like the Schumann harmonic series, into a piezo quartz cube, and it implodes. And the quartz cube is a rotating conjugator because of the z-axis helix. And sure enough, that quartz cube in the Minkowski Frost made 800 times its own weight. So there we have an introduction to the difference between impulse power and warp power in Star Trek from an electrical engineering perspective. And we've talked about this before, but those equations for impulse power versus warp power are in the PDF set. I'm sorry, I got the wrong one. It's fractalfield.com. fractalfield.com/propulsion. Now, you're saying, why is this appropriate to a biologic architecture class? Well, let me suggest that the definition of shaman, shaman, and the definition of temple, from my view as an electrical engineer, is plasma projector. You see, you can tell they're going to schedule a war to happen around the Stargate. That the Stargate in this case is Uru, Asa, El, M. We've talked about this before. Jerusalem, Uru, of ancient dragon blood, Asa, queen of the royal, El, the place of implosive phase transition, phase shift, where the L happens. Uru, Asa, El, M. There's a place in Pennsylvania in this Eagle star map called Elimsport, which serves the same function as where the Elves made their port, and sure enough, they're one of the largest springs in the state. It's a plasma projector. So why is it always that they schedule a war to be around the Stargate? In ancient times, this was called Dirana. In modern times, this is called the War over Jerusalem. The reason is because people are unconsciously aware that if you don't make it to the Stargate in time, you're toast. What they mean by that is that when humans grow up, they only get out of kindergarten unless they can project their plasma orb, their Ka, their plasma, cold plasma body, through their neighboring star, because only the neighboring star, in this case the sun, the Anu heart, has the inertial escape velocity, which is the only way in and out of here if you're actually going to grow up. If you go in and out in heavy metal, they know you're from the wrong side of the tracks. So the only way in and out of here that's in the least bit respectable is as a plasma ball through the heart of the sun. In Enki and Hermes and Tutankhamun, Akhenaten sense of sun god. So plasma bulbs that are coherent enough to be projected through the heart of their star are the only thing respectable to emerge from a gene pool like Earth, otherwise basically stuck in kindergarten. And unfortunately, our local star is famous. Actually, if you listen to the ETs that I've been listening to, our local star is famous for burping regularly, meaning that the real estate here is cheap, effectively, relatively, because the star burps too frequently. Therefore, you need to learn how to grow up and get in and out through the Stargate, Dirana through the heart of the sun. Otherwise, basically, you're toast. And this is the concept Dirana, or Stargate, as argued by Anton Parks elegantly. And another example of a Dirana is Therify.net, which is phase conjugate plasma, and the shaman experiences that as a kind of plasma projected Stargate. So, am I saying we need to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon? Well, the Temple of the Soul of Man? What am I saying here? What I'm saying is that there is no sustainability to the human aura that does not involve a thread of embedding through the heart of the sun. And so you have not achieved a shamanic sustainability until you can see through the sun as an eyeball. And that is the Solar Heart Community, a Yahoo group that we started with all the solar shamans who experienced the heart of the sun as an eyeball, an organ of perception. They were quite clear it was cool and inviting and not hot at all, which is what we know is the quality of conjugate imploding, which is the heart of hydrogen, the heart of the Anu, which is how clairvoyants see the heart of the sun, the 7's 5 spin, perfect slip knot, etc., etc. So am I getting too esoteric here? Probably. Is it appropriate? I still think so. We're going to get back to our table of materials here. But Eden Grace is asking, what ETs am I listening to? Well, thank you, Eden, for asking the fun question. There's another upcoming course, which is my view on the extraterrestrial origin of DNA. But my short summary of answer to that question is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And just a little clue that when I fainted in the gold sarcophagus of Tutankhamun in Cairo and remembered what he felt. For example, I knew why the priests were using his blood to regulate the rainfall. I knew how. I realized that bloodline was part, I wouldn't call it reincarnation, I wouldn't say reincarnation of anybody, but I would say fragment of soul memory, yes, which is basically the hermetic intention. Remember the name of the Egyptian lineage of royal families is called Thutmose, which means sons of Thoth Tahuti. So that gives you a clue. What was his agenda? His agenda was to teach exactly what we're discussing this evening, which is how to make sustainable auras, to make the gene pool sustainable, which is to say the definition of all sustainability is the centripetal negentropy that phase conjugation makes, which he named the caduceus. So this is a hermetic science, clearly, and I emphasize the word science. Now, the anecdotal part of that story is, yes, I spent a lot of time with Alex Collier, who claimed to communicate with the Andromedans and resonated deeply to much of his message, actually. And we had communication with various groups when I lived in North Carolina, where when I began to realize what clairaudience meant in my case after years of Kundalini, for example, seated under the old tree at the top of the hill of what was the Cherokee sacred burial ground, where many women would wake up crying and in panic, which is where the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee began, I realized I was hearing ancestors' voices quite literally, which is why I was so fascinated when Korotkov measured the electric field that enabled hearing ancestor memories. And then later I came to find out that the Cherokee word for Ophanim was Adawi, and that the Cherokee alphabet, which is related to Greek, turns out to be basically Ophanim Enochian, and that the Ophanim is a name for interstellar plasma beings who have a certain agenda. Michael Sariam calls them macrobes, and he says they're the bad guys. But that interstellar plasma bodies have needs, and they have use for certain gene pools like ours if we can get our show together and grow up and steer a few tornadoes. But let's return to that conversation after we do the biologic architecture. But just one final thought there, that in terms of if Eden Grace is asking what ETs I'm listening to, she's probably asking for open disclosure in terms of what my political agendas might be. That could be a fun conversation. But in summary, I would say in Daniel Stewart's book, God King Akhenaten, about the Syrian ETs responsible for the Akhenaten experience, I resonate to that stated attention, and this is related to biologic architecture. I have an excuse for telling this story now. The Syrians basically went to Akhenaten, who was basically the best genetics that about 10,000 years of genetic intervention could make, given the fact that the Egyptian royal line is named Thutmose, sons of Thoth Tahuti, so obviously Enki, Thoth, Hermes genetic plans climaxed in the bloodline of the Egyptian royal lineage. So, they were breeding show dogs, and Akhenaten was the best they could cook up after X number of thousand years. So the Syrians come to Akhenaten and they say, hey, your gene pool is going to be toast unless you can make a temple that can plasma project, because you can't get soul groups back through their stars unless you have a lens called the Sun Temple. And so Akhenaten was assigned this job to build Amenti, Amarna. Actually, we have a picture of this golden mean.info/Amenti, about the Stargate that Akhenaten was assigned to build. And this was somewhere in my soul memory, and I resonate to this. I'm revealing my political agenda now. So Akhenaten gets about half done building his plasma projector, which is like a soul group that has learned how to lucid dream collectively as one body, and eventually has a shot at taking that collective plasma body out through the sun, which is to say, grow up and get out of kindergarten. And what do they need to do it? They need a Dharana, a temple, a Stargate, and a Menti, and a Marna. So the Syrians, and I think the Syrians were famous for selling guns to both sides of a war. It's an old story, if you believe the Montauk description of the 22 different ETs that have messed with our DNA. But the Syrians got Akhenaten, Akun, Atun, Aku, and Raku. He got Akhenaten focused on his job, which was build this plasma projector, the perfect temple. And what does he do? He gets a good start. There's an underground complex at Amenti Amarna, which functionally, electrically, could do exactly what Theraphi is designed to do, what phase conjugate implosion, what actually a Dharana, a Stargate is. Remember, the alphabet used in the movie Stargate, Ophanum Enochian, is the hypercube, which was the Cherokee alphabet, which was the hypercube that John Dee was the world leader in the mathematics of the next dimension, the symmetry axes. What did I do with it? The symmetry axes of donuts. If you get them phased at the right angle, you make an implosive vortex at the center called Dharana, otherwise known as the movie Stargate. And the guy who made the movie was my boss at Transicon, Guy, Rick Hassan, in Boulder, and that's another story. What a life. I guess I'm the Forrest Gump of. So, point being, Akhenaten then screws up bad and realizes that he'll never be able to balance a checkbook. And so the bankers, otherwise known as the Amun-Ra priests, they fire him and kick him out of town. It was the Amun versus the Atun. The Amun were Enlil's priests and the Atun were Enki's priests. And so then Akhenaten basically changes his name to Moses, which means the son of, and becomes a gold powder cook, and finds the Essenes, steals the Ark of the Covenant, and used the gold powder as the cash cow, which is how the Essenes were founded, and hence the bloodline, Genesis of the Grail King. And Lawrence Gardner agrees with the book on the Egyptian origin of the Christianity, the book is called Out of Egypt by Ahmed Osman, which then Lawrence Gardner later agreed that the Egyptian roots of the Essenes. So Akhenaten had lost it, unable to build the right kind of temple because he can't balance a checkbook. And the Amun-Ra priests are the bankers, so of course they kick him out. Runs for his life, changes his name to Moses, goes go, and then the whole theater of the incarnation of that bloodline, which formerly was called Moses, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, then becomes Moses and Aaron, otherwise known as the righteous priests. And if you read those books, which Lawrence Gardner is no slouch as a historian, agrees that the Jesus story, the biggest chunk of that story, is basically Tutankhamun, or at least the sun god part of the story. So the whole mythology centers around who can be the guy that gets their plasma big enough to steer through the heart of the sun, carrying their silver seed to a new heart in the sun. So I'm going to stop telling that story right now, in the sense that now we have generated a philosophy which explains why the fabrication of the correct kind of temple is essential for the survival of the gene pool. That you don't need to have religion wars over Stargates, Jerusalem, if you know how to build a Stargate. Because that Stargate, it's broken. It's not aligned up anymore. The capacitance ain't working. Sorry, the electrical engineers are not able to fix it. No, got to build a new one. How shall we do that? Ooh, well, I think we're going to need electrical engineers. You know, it's very fine to have this woo description of, geometry and sacred architecture, but I would like to make the point that geometry in architecture is only useful if it produces the bioactive field. So the definition of success is not, oh, the ratio among the walls makes magic numbers. No, 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 no. Magic numbers are cool only if they produce the kind of electric field that immortalizes. Otherwise, all the numbers, all the geometry, all the numerology is crap. Sorry, but actually the functional definition of success of biologic architecture is to build the kind of electric field that immortalizes. Hence, the Shem unto the Lord. Okay, did we finish with our little table of materials here? We sort of did. We talked about the stones, and we showed which ones were the worst capacitance, the worst dielectric. Notice why the woods, the close grains are the hardwoods, and they have a more dense capacitance, and the less close grains are the softwood, and they're a little less useful, et cetera, et cetera. And then of the metals, for example, aluminum, steel are really destructive to life force. Iron is sort of in the middle, and copper, silver, and then the platinum group metals are excellent. Now, you say, let's take the example. Why would I say that iron could, of course, be useful to biology? And obviously, a lot of biology is built on iron. We are iron blood people. Why then am I saying steel is such bad news? That allows us to have a molecular conversation that when you take iron in a natural biologic bond structure and you submit that iron to the intense heat and bond that makes steel, you freeze the iron into a geometry which is opposite to a conjugator, literally pain embedded. The worst possible example of that might well be aluminum. In my view, a bauxite, for example, raw material of aluminum, is not in itself evil, but the electric current that's used to fuse bauxite into aluminum is some of the most opposite to conjugate structure on the planet, which translates to mean that aluminum is some of the most poisonous to all biology common materials on the planet, to the point where elementals, it's famous if you're a geobiologist, clairvoyant, working with elementals, if they inadvertently touch aluminum, like a big chunk of aluminum in the soil or something, it can well kill them or freeze them or paralyze them. So to elementals, this is like the death field. Well, I suggest, let me give you an example. I think there have been about 3 major examples of huge, globally significant ecological disasters in the last decade. I think there was one in Iceland, one in one of the Eastern European countries, one in South America, which were like basically bauxite and aluminum plant, and had this huge ecological catastrophe, this overflow, et cetera, et cetera. And I think actually that the healthy elementals of the planet, they actually conspire to destroy aluminum plants, and that the health statistics of people who work in aluminum plants are probably the worst on the planet in terms of which kind of industry is the most fatal. Because touching aluminum foil for much of your day, there's no better way to kill yourself, I mean electrically from that point of view, because aluminum is a form of capacitance which prevents the human aura from propagating efficiently. It is literally terribly bad karma to build a big aluminum plant. I say, they say they've reinvented the economy of Iceland by putting a big aluminum plant there. And I say that is death to your elementals and that it's horrible karma. But again, you couldn't know that until you understood what living plasma is. All human interaction is about charge. And then you could know that it's bad karma to invest in an aluminum plant. Because It's going to kill the elementals. And ultimately then you're going to have more tornadoes that are out of control because the elementals are going to be mad at you. This is electrical engineering 101 for geobiologists. Okay. So let's look at a practical example. On the left, we have one of Michael Rice's designs for a healing center, pent, deca, spiral, implosive, living biological materials. On the right, we have an example of the most unhealthy possible geobiology. In this case, it's a picture of a hospital here in South France. I went into that hospital and I felt immediately horribly nauseous. It was terrible. It was one of the worst biologies that I'd probably been in, even worse than the steel geodesic dome from Bucky Fuller. And so we made a list of everything that was done wrong in this modern hospital to create the most deathly geobiology possible. That's called a hospital. So the ceilings were low, cutting off the aura. The ceilings were full of electrosmog and the wrong spectrum of lighting and high voltage transformers, everything possible that could kill your aura. The ceilings were of a synthetic material and they had this steel and aluminum cross grid in the ceilings. There was a loud hum. The air was completely dead, was full of electrosmog, nothing organic in sight. It was the most really sickening environment that I had walked into in a very long time, and this is called a hospital. You see, if you do not understand what life is, it's not possible to build structures which actually create life. This is why I say that the biology department and architecture departments at universities that are located in steel and aluminum structures are proof that they don't know what biology or architecture is. This is our slide about the work of Professor Ron Eglash, who did wonderful work on fractality in African architecture. And we've talked about this before, but just to review, this is his drawing of the classic African village structure. So that each of these houses in the village is made of biologic material, bamboo and straw, for example. And notice that they have a pine cone egg shape, each house. And the largest house is at the top of the egg, and it's embedded in that is the shaman's house or the tribal chief. And then inside the tribal chief or shaman's house is the altar. Now notice that's perfectly fractally embedded inside of. It's totally fractal. It's totally biologic materials. And if this was done properly, like a sweat lodge, this structure would be located on a magnetic line cross here. So the same way you would locate the siting of a labyrinth or locate the siting of a cathedral, sometimes called Cistercian, meaning the cistern, meaning on the water vein magnetic line cross, that by embedding this on what's called a blind spring or JED, the upwelling of magnetic earth currents because of a magnetic line cross, you create fractality in African architecture. Where did this skill come from? I say, again, maybe I see Hermes and Thoth and Enki everywhere, but I say when Credo Mutwa told us personally that the Zulu name for Enki was Kiliman, as in Kilimanjaro, I say the Nubian famous black pharaoh skill came from Hermes, that the fractality of African architecture is an example of a hermetic skill. We talked about this slide about the measurement of sacred space. This is the Conference on Biologic Architecture, which was the largest on the planet, and these are all architecture students and faculty members predominantly at University, Americana University in Mexico City in 2007. Sponsors were Arturo and Nina, and you can see here's Arturo here. Here's Michael Rice, and here's Aldrich, and here's me. And the point was that the faculty of this school could not believe how many students just wanted to come and study biologic architecture. And they realized that this was a compelling curriculum. And since that time, our biologic curriculum has become the leading one on the planet, really. This was the follow-up conference. I think this was 2 years later, 2009, in Cardiff, Wales, on biologic architecture called Life Form. And the sponsors of that group, biologicalarchitecture.co.uk. Should have put the website on here. And also this, we had the same teachers. Yes, biologic architecture. Now here's what I wanted to talk about in terms of living architecture and Professor Callahan. Professor Callahan had determined that, well, he determined that the paramagnetic quality of soil was a predictor of life force. And the way he found this was he was traveling in the Amazon, and he found he could predict in advance whether the next tribe down the river was going to be friendly or headhunters. And the way he would tell was he would measure the paramagnetic conductivity of the soil. If the soil allowed magnetic flux permissive, which is to say allowed the magnetic lines to travel freely, then the next tribe was likely to be friendly. Whereas if the soil would prevent magnetic flux, then the next tribe were likely to be headhunters. And this he then extrapolated into a science of peacemaking. And our curriculum for teaching the science of peacemaking, based on the geobiology of paramagnetism in land, the architecture of land magnetics, is at goldenmean.info/peace university. Typing the link in now. It's a very extensive curriculum. And it goes something like this. It says that Professor Callahan, something of a hero here. He's the hero of Acres Magazine USA, and we made a documentary with him in Florida personally. I enjoyed. He's getting older now, amazing man. And his theory goes like this. If the magnetic line between village A and village B gets broken, then they're much more likely to make war. And so he went to Ireland and Yugoslavia and Israel, and he made measurements. And sure enough, he said that you could predict where war was going to break out by measuring when the magnetic lines broke. And that what prevents war is to assemble magnetic lines to look like a rose. And then subsequently a demonstration, and this would make sense because if the magnetic lines look like a rose, which is to say negentropic and centripetal, they create permaculture, which is to say a bioregion whose genetic inclusive charge field is sustainable due to negentropy, due to phase conjugate fractality. So thus you define sustainability in terms of negentropy. And my book claims to describe accurately the origin of all biologic negentropy and therefore the origin of all sustainability. Applying that to peacemaking, peacemaking is then defined as creating an electric field which doesn't make war with itself. So if you understand non-destructive interference for waves, you can understand non-destructive interference for people, which is to say how waves make peace is the same way that people make peace. How did we prove that? Well, in Vukovar in Yugoslavia, Marty Kane, who worked with us, a very famous labyrinth builder, martykane.com, our project on labyrinth building for peacemaking, goldenmean.info/labyrinth. So in the war in Yugoslavia, they measured the fact that when the war came and some of the bombs fell, during the war, one of the most immediate consequences, among others, was the disappearance of the underground water veins. Imagine, if you were touching your lover, you find out if your lover likes you because when you touch her or when she touches you, it causes the skin to become pink. The name for that is called vasodilation, the opposite of vasoconstriction. So you know your lover likes you if she sends her blood to the surface when you touch her. This is called the Order of the Red Hand in the sense of William Butler Yeats, because in the West, where we all have become hypertensive, vasodilation is a forgotten skill. The ice skater never gets to unpack her hands. She's always vasoconstricted, never vasodilated. And you know what that does to your spin density. So the vasodilated blood to the surface is called underground water. So the Earth says, oops, the people are making war. I have to retract my blood because if I let my blood, I mean my water, to the surface, I will feel pain, otherwise known as war. So that's why the underground water goes bye-bye during war. Well, so they decided, once they understood that, at Vukovar in Yugoslavia, and Marty Kane flew over there with a team of women. And what they did was they installed a certain series of these very powerful, well-doused labyrinths. And labyrinth making is classically a feminine skill called permission to touch. And sure enough, the underground water came back. So what they did was they created charge embedding, and that creates vasodilation for the Earth, which is the water has permission to come to the surface. A similar phenomenon exists where we created this Sri Yantra in the Desert Project, and you can see that at goldenmean.info/Italian, where we make this huge Sri Yantra the size of 3 football fields, shallow trench in the ground, filled with highly paramagnetic piezo rock powder, calcite and quartz, and you create a long wave, standing waveform in the land. And sure enough, Bill Witherspoon proved that it eliminated geopathic zones for miles around, increased the rainfall, restored the fertility. All they did was magnetic line columnation, long wave magnetic coherence, charge embedding, implosion, restores water, restores fertility. And exactly a parallel principle is we talked about it last time, the physics of Agnihotra, where the cow dung is lit in a plasma flame inside a phase conjugate dielectric capacitor called a copper or a gold pyramid, Agnihotra, and the plasma flame is ignited precisely at sunrise sunset, which is the right angle of the light of charge called phase conjugate, which allows a centripetal plasma to be created in the land, and these should be placed at the energy line crosses. And there's a huge fertility effect as well as a rejuvenation effect for people, et cetera, et cetera. And Agnihotra would be related to Theraphi and related to rejuvenation fields in general. So these are examples of biologic architecture. Next slide. Yeah, so this is talking about where peace would break out. It's goldenmean.info/peace university is a curriculum. We talk about peacemaking in the mind is a phase conjugate brainwave signature. Peacemaking in the heart, a phase conjugate HRV signature. I'm on it goes. Peacemaking in the shape of touch. Oh, if you learn how to squeeze your lover in the centric waveform for love, then the shape of pressure over time of that perfect wave shape, which is also the pressure geometry of the perfect birth canal, is the centric waveform for love, where the moment of max pressure arrives at golden ratio, which sets a heterodyne cascade, which is implosive, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually do the love hug by studying the physics of the perfect squeeze process, which is obviously implosive. And then we have peacemaking in music. We have the implosion sound project, fractalfield.com/implosion sound. Example of wave mechanics for peacemaking, which is say negentropy. Peacemaking by restoring measurable charge, teachable life force in food and agriculture and the land. So it's a whole Peace University curriculum, which is adjunct to the biologic architecture curriculum. Now, we had done a project to restore rainmaking in Australia, and rainmaking was very close to Tutankhamun Akhenaten's heart. And rainmaking is a science which we will only mention in passing here, but the article is at goldenmean.info/rain. You know that when rolling thunder tickled the underbelly of a very certain type of black beetle, not unlike the famous scarab of Egypt. That black beetle's nervous system was obviously very fractal. You can do something very similar by invoking, holding, and charging a very live pine cone if you want to seed a cloud, for example. So rainmaking has a lot to do with providing the symmetry around which water vapor can converge. And proper architecture, fractal architecture, will make rain, and architecture of dead buildings and steel metal grids will prevent rain dramatically. For example, the Bill Witherspoon experiments and the idea that Prague is a magnetic map which looks like a rose and thus will fabricate its own microclimate. And we have the notion from Wilhelm Reich about desertification and patriarchy. Let me see if I can find the link. goldenmean.info/desertification. So this is the link to that. It's what happened was James DeMayo wrote this very useful paper. You know, and I criticized poor James DeMayo, who's probably the best Wilhelm Reich scientist on the planet, and he's a great guy. And our partner in Torino, Kudai, is translating his book, and we introduced him. It's a good thing. My criticism was only that he should use electrical engineering language to define orgone, but you know, that's a semantic issue. Yeah, thank you. And Trevor Constable, and Trevor Constable's famous book, Weather Engineering and the High Seas. Do you know what the most effective capacitor for rainmaking was? It was a 60-degree cone. You know what the angle between the outer dodeca and the inner dodeca in the structure is? A 60-degree implosion cone. You know what the angle of the vortex nozzle of the imploder.com is? 60-degree implosion. So why was the best capacitor for rainmaking a perfect 60-degree imploding cone? Because obviously phase conjugation. So just to review the pure science, what is the difference between water vapor and water vapor that knows how to make a droplet? In terms of the architecture of rainmaking, where this is solving the problem of deserts. The difference between water vapor and water vapor that chooses to make a droplet is permission to touch, which is to say permission to be enveloped or embedded. It's sometimes known as precipitation in magic and chemistry, or the physics of implosion. Take the example. Any nice, healthy child who's learned how to be barefoot in mud can focus on a cloud and put a hole in it. It's best usually to ask permission from the cloud first. But the physics is because the attention of the charge of the charge field of the attention of the child, as Bill Tiller measured, creates a centripetal force. What Bill Tiller measured was that focused human attention causes charge to compress. He measured it in a dozen ways. It's irrefutable. Focused human attention causes charge compression. This is known, this is proven, and Bill Tiller did a good job of measuring it. He was clueless as to why that happened or what the mechanism was, but he clearly measured the phenomena. In my view, I am the first to explain why this is so, because focused human attention is a phase conjugate negentropic centripetal electric field. And therefore, being centripetal, it would cause the water vapor to converge with permission to touch and be enveloped, embedded, and create a droplet. So that is why a child focusing in a cloud makes a hole in that cloud. And the more psychokinetic, which is say phase conjugate they are, the bigger the hole they can make in that cloud. Introduction to Tornado Steering 101. What does that have to do with biologic architecture? Well, this means that Supposing you are California and you're having some drought problems, and you notice that your cities are this square metal grid, and you notice that every time a cloud is coming in from the ocean, it gets about such a distance from the shoreline, and it sees, oh, there's that ugly metal city over there full of electrosmog. And these clouds, they don't want to come over those cities. Nope, they go around. Why? Because the water vapor in that cloud is not stupid. The water vapor in that cloud knows the difference between life and death. It's the same way that if you get a couple of billion plankton together, and the plankton in the sea decide they need rain, they will make rain. They know how to do that. They create the right electrostatic conditions, and they make their own microclimate. So clearly, a couple of billion plankton in the sea are very skilled at knowing how to make rain when they need it. Unfortunately, human architects, not so smart. So, on the other hand, if you have a magnetic map of a city like Prague, which is a rose, you will attract rain and money and people and energy. So this is the fundamental concept of biologic architecture. I wanted just to mention on the bottom of this slide, they mention this philosophy about water follows magnetism, follows symmetry, follows awareness here. Water follows magnetism, follows symmetry, follows implosion, follows awareness, which is ability to self-refer, which is to say self-embed, would define awareness because it allows a little donut to get inside the next bigger donut non-destructively, which is to say to perfect embedding. And that ability, called embed ability, is the ability then to implode, which is the ability to get centripetal, which is the opposite of getting dead. And so that's how you define awareness, is non-destructive self-reentry, which in the Bible was the Bereshith at first in principle, which we now know is the sequence of turns of mind. If you take the letters of Bereshith, the first word of Genesis, you have the first letter of Beta, and the last letter is Hey. You simply walked inside out on the surface of a donut. Ability to turn inside out non-destructively is in the beginning at first in principle. And so that's the beginning of awareness. Recursion. So, getting back here, we were talking about the example in Australia. It's called example, a compost pile temperature increases by steering magnetic lines into it. So that, that it is so common that in biodynamic schools, you measure the success of the farm by taking the temperature of the compost pile. And if you can cook your dinner in the compost pile, generally it's a pretty good biodynamic farm. Well, the extreme case of this was Malcolm Borgward, our teacher in Perth, Australia. And I think I told the story last time, but he got the compost pile of the farm. It was a huge underground cavity in which they kept the temperature and regulated the microbes so beautifully. So they had this very intelligent compost pile of that farm, which basically is radiating a microwave cloud with such coherence that the joke was that the compost pile was running the farm. And how you could tell, we told this story last time, but how you could tell that the compost pile was running the farm? Because there was actually a photograph, I believe, that Malcolm tells the story, that there's this cloud of pestilence. It was I don't know if it was a locust or what it was, but there was a cloud of pestilence that was taking over and ravaging all the farms in the neighborhood. But that cloud of pestilence came to the farm with his compost pile, and you could actually see the cloud of pests jump over this farm and go to the next one. Wouldn't touch anything close to that compost pile. Why? Because the microwave coherence of the DNA radiance of that very happy compost pile was running that farm. That's why. So this is an example of a centripetal field which becomes self-aware. If you make the microbial plasma field happy enough, you got a self-awareness that they can make the decisions and run the farm. That was the joke. This is the picture from James DeMeo. We were just talking about this desertification and patriarchy, where he's saying that you can make a map of the spread of the Great Sahara Desert he calls it the patrist heartland here, by mapping the spread of hard patriarchal cultures, culture in which permission to touch is forbidden. This is very important. Now, I'm not criticizing just the Muslim tradition here. I'm criticizing most religious traditions who do not understand permission to touch. I mean, you could see if you allowed children to dance barefoot in the mud and then let them hold hands and be blissful together, that you could watch the clouds form over them. There's dozens of examples of photographs of clouds forming over yoga camps where Sufi groups were having bliss in circles. What is the reason for the cloud formations? Well, it's simple. That permission to touch for people is permission to touch for waves, is permission to touch for water. Charge distribution efficiency, which is named fractality, which is the principle of the feminine, is permission to touch for waves. Now, which defines living architecture for wave geometry in general. It is the living architecture for waves. So what is it about the religions of planet Earth that are afraid of touch? Now, I'm not advocating any kind of, promiscuity here. No, what I'm advocating is a culture within which the distribution of children is permissive. Jesus in the wagon train he had hundreds of aunts and uncles, so this is a well-distributed wave, this Jesus child. Well, the metaphor is the same as we talked about it. Albert Szent-György's Nobel-winning electronic biology and cancer from Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory. And he measures and proves that the cell that prevents cancer is the one that has the triplet state electron, which is the kid that has extended family for electrons. In other words, extremely orderly water, more orderly than ice in the cellular water, ice 9 for cell water, clathrate cell water, allows extremely distributed electron shells called triplet state electron. And this water, more orderly than ice, is the difference between cancer and health. And Albert Szent-Györgyi proved it. And what is that? Charge distribution efficiency. So what does that mean? A child that can be distributed among hundreds or dozens of families, which are all part of the extended family, is a very healthy child. But what is the key to allowing that child to have freedom on many families that are connected? The key is that every family knows the rules. The children are allowed to do this, and they're not allowed to hurt themselves. They're not allowed to hurt others. The children are free, but they must have discipline. Ha-ha! So when all the families know the rules, then the child can be a well-distributed awareness, a well-distributed wave, a triplet state electron, a fractal field. And this is the difference between health and cancer for the child and the water and the cell and the wave. So religion's fear of touch is directly related to the fear of being able to be embedded in a fractal. Let's take another example. A child is in a school and the child has urge to touch. And then in schools in Western cultures, unfortunately, touch is not permitted. So Carl Jung, he proved that urge to touch frustrated becomes anger by definition. Urge to touch frustrated become anger by definition, Carl Jung called the origin of the Balinese cockfight, effectively the origin of football. Because urge to touch frustrated becomes anger, and this is a poison pellet, literally a turd, which must get pushed out, sometimes called a football. So to get that anger out, that football out, you have this thing called testosterone poisoning, and you pay your football players more than your teachers, which is a sacrilege. So the need for football exists. Remember, football is one of the most unhealthy things possible. It's destructive to your body. It causes brain injuries. I mean, the thing is absolute perversion. Excuse me very much. I am a national publicity representative for the National Football League, and I am paid to advertise. I'm joking. So, football creates death, injury, because of testosterone poisoning. The testosterone poisoning wouldn't build up if there was permission to touch. In other words, that young boy, David Icke, for example, who hurts himself because of football, did so because permission to touch was not possible. And permission to touch was not possible because that culture was afraid of touch, because that culture was afraid of bliss. So effectively, it's like the church in Italy when I first taught the definition of culture. I said the definition of culture was not color of your shoe polish and your wine and your bow tie. No, the definition of culture is the ability and the skill to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience, because that will create their immune system and allow them to be immortal. So if they have access to a form of bliss, they have access to the final form of the internet, which is actually implosion of charge, all biologic information, and they have access to an immune system, which you don't have without bliss, and they have access to memory through death. So clearly, as an electrical engineer, we could say that the definition of culture is the skill to teach your young people how to have bliss. Now, by this definition of culture, it is clear that in the West, we do not have culture. I am saying this to the French, to the Italian, to the German, to the Americans. I am saying until you have the skill to teach young people how to have bliss, you do not have culture. So you can go to the Ministry of Culture in each of these countries and say, Dan Winter has suggested that you do not have culture in your country yet until you learn to teach your children how to have a bliss experience. And this is a skill that the Sufis had, the Aboriginals had, and the Native American Indians had. And the urge to have a bliss experience is so fundamental. Your body knows that you're basically toast until you have access to bliss. In fact, from an electrical engineering perspective, you are functionally a parasite until you have access to bliss, because you do not have your own source of charge. You know, they say people in the city learn to get their energy from other people. People in the country learn to get the energy from the land. But ultimately, the ability to implode and create your own source of charge, called human bliss, is the difference between being a parasite electrically and having your own source of energy or charge, and your own source of information. Now, access to bliss is so explosive politically. The very word politics comes from body polis, which means, you know, a beehive is absolutely not stupid enough to swarm until they have a body polish, which is to say enough plasma coherence to be projective. That's when a beehive swarms, and then they need royal blood to steer the tornado. Hence, you can't swarm without a queen. Well, in human condition, you get critical mass of plasma, a group that could lucid dream and have a bliss experience together, and then they could plasma project just like a beehive swarming, and it's just as natural, and they can just the same way go through the heart of the sun, the same way the bees navigate. And if you don't get access to this bliss experience, you're functionally toast. You're not going to get your plasma through the heart of the sun. So it is absolutely essential to get access to this peak bliss experience. And Korotkov measured the electrical qualities of the bliss experience, and we have the 4 different clear criteria for the electrical measurement of bliss at goldenmean.info/clinical intro, which then became the curriculum for the teaching of the physics of the cause of perception, fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. I'm typing the links in here. So what am I saying? We're going to go into this whole story of how fear of touch radiated from the fear of women, which is the origin of every religion on planet Earth. Basically, every religion on planet Earth starts with fear of women. Why? tune into the next class on the ET origins of human DNA. But the short version of that story is the Anunnaki Draco was a female-dominated culture, which is probably more perverse than our male-dominated culture. So we're doing a Groundhog Day with this little phenomena. The point is that the principle of being feminine, which is to say the principle of being fractal, is simply permission to touch for waves. How to think about that in terms of the architecture, the biologic architecture? Eggs are more fractal than seeds. Your mother's 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 eggs was inside your mother's mother's mother whole when your mother's mother's mother was born. This is not true of a sperm. This is only true of an egg, which is to say the feminine have more access to that lineage of immortality. Eve was tracked down in the fractality of her mitochondria. They didn't track down Adam that way. No, they tracked down Eve. Now, in human bliss process, this means that the male kundalini is more projective, more explosive, but more at risk to the loss of its own immortality, whereas the female kundalini is more self-reentrant and therefore less at risk of loss of immortality. So it's a very different kind of kundalini. And again, we'll have that conversation in another course, but we talk about the biomechanics of kundalini, goldenmean.info/kundalini. Okay, so we're running close to our time window here, and I just wanted to see if we'd finish the basic slides we were going to talk about. That just my excuse for talking about human bliss so much in this intro to biologic architecture is to say that functionally, the ability to create the electric field to enable bliss, peak perception, peak performance. Note that the bliss experience inside Therify.net, our plasma field project, Peter has consistently reported that people having that plasma implosion experience consistently report, quote, better decision-making skills. What does that tell you? The ability to focus and sort perception, that this implosive conjugate plasma field creates the peak perception. Literally, introduction to bliss 101. So the fabrication of human peak, we'll call it peak performance when you're selling it to sports, and you sell it, peak perception when you're telling it to universities. But functionally, it is bliss. And bliss means simply that your aura becomes so radiant, penetrant, and embeddable that it creates a large domain. And may the dominus vobiscum. I mean, that's our word for God is that domain. So that's how important it is. And that is fractal. So to understand what biologic architecture is for is almost the same thing, in my opinion, as understanding the electrical biology of bliss process and how it's generated. Here's the picture of fractality at Stonehenge. We talked about this, the difference in seed growth. That the temple in man, fundamentally, this is Schwaller de Lubitz and Robert Lawler, beautiful work showing that the function of temple is to build a plasma field of the shape of man because, as above, so below is a name for fractality. That's why. Here we're just showing that the geometry of the trees over a rock fault bends. Their curvature is dictated by the capacitance of the piezo field of the rock stress. So it's very important for biologic architecture to make a magnetic map of your building, and the underground, Olda is very expert at making foundations without steel and aluminum to create appropriate charge fields. This is about major magnetic maps, in this case, Holy Grail across the Atlantic, fractal ley line crosses. This is good here. This is a map of the radiance of the capacitive field of biologic structure. Can you see here why a 90-degree angle is considered evil in Feng Shui? Because it creates a capacitive field which is more destructive. If these angles had been 30 or 72, this would have led to less destructive capacitive interference at the angle of curvature. So we say that the physics of biologic architecture of Feng Shui is to understand constructive wave interference is a name for what are called evil angles in Feng Shui and astrology. Similar in astrology, 90-degree angle is called evil or stressful, specifically because that's opposite to conjugate. This is the Ark of the Covenant story. We talked about this, the acacia wood and the gold creating implosive conjugate dielectrics and fabrication of gold powder at the spark gap, et cetera, et cetera. And then this was actually later used as a way to non-destructively contain radioactive materials. This is archetype of perfect biologic architecture. This device could non-destructively contain nukes because implosive capacitance is the opposite of radioactivity. This desperately needs to be understood and proved as we deal with Fukushima and similar problems. That basically any field which is profoundly centripetal is the opposite of radioactivity. This is also the physics of why, as Uri Geller proved, focused human attention measurably reduces radioactivity. Gravity anomaly maps, maps of magnetic lines, geobiology. I see it's after 10, so I think we're going to open this up to dialogue soon. This is just some of the detectors we used for measuring magnetic lines. This is one of the better ones at the time. A nanotesla measure of magnetic lines is a way you start the magnetic map of your building. Actually, we didn't finish this course very well because we were supposed to talk about the sequence of steps to planning a building. You make a magnetic map, you decide where to embed the structure in land, you avoid the water veins to sleep on, and then you plan a foundation that avoids metal, and then you create breathing through the walls, both capacitively in the air, which Aldrich Hosman is so good at, arc.cz. So I guess we're going to say that this conversation on biologic architecture is only half done, and the next half of this course will be when this course repeats in 2 months' time. And I'm going to open this conversation up to questions here. Okay, can you please discuss the info on slide 55? Fine, we'll go to slide 55. Eden has a question. This is the rainbow serpent. We had some fun slides here. I guess I got carried away. But you recognize most of this. We've been teaching. This is the dodeca ecosa Earth grid. Isn't this from anti-gravity in the world grid? This is already actually stabilized, fabricated coherent gravity field, and therefore hold atmosphere on planets. This is planet taming 101. And your atmosphere goes bye-bye unless you understand how to make the centripetal field to hold atmosphere. It's so fundamental. Okay, slide 55. Okay. About the galactic gravity discontinuity, how this affects our energy. Okay. Eden's question. Well, this slide was meant to suggest that our particular arm of the galactic golden spirals, called the Orion arm, had a discontinuity, which is here. I'm circulating in red. And the myth here, and this is mythology. This mythology comes from a group called the Reverend Mothers that we did ritual in Pennsylvania, which later become the Reverend Mothers in Dune, who said that if you look up and see giant explosions in the Orion arm, this is our ancestors. That's what they said, which is sort of a scene from the movie Tron and Blade Runner, depends which movie you happen to like, but I do believe it's true that the Orion Wars is the story of the Draco, the Uru. And this is a story we will tell in the upcoming course here at Fractal U on the ET origins of DNA. But your question was, what does this have to do with us? Well, this break in the spiral of the stars in our Orion arm is said to do with the fact that we've been blowing up stars for too long, at least our ancestors, the Draco, the Uru, in the Orion Wars. The Orion Wars are also called the Oxygen Wars. And the Oxygen Wars have to do with the fact that, those ancestors were probably nitrogen breathing. We discussed that at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. Fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And that's best encapsulated in the movie Total Recall about the loss of the atmosphere on Mars. That the fact that the oxygen going down, the nitrogen's going up on Earth is an indicator of who's winning the Orion Wars now here on Earth, and unfortunately it's not the humans at the moment. But So there is a deep genetic memory of these wars among the stars, and I think the best book to read on that regard is Secret of the Dark Stars, which is one of the Anton Parks books, which is now out in English. And AntonParks.com, which is now Pahana Books, has his English books. Now, what is the secret of the dark stars, and what does that have to do with? You asked a hard question about how this affects our energy of human levels. The secret of the dark stars, spoiler alert, the secret of the dark stars is the fact that our ancestors were the black holes. Hello. You know, we know that all our good ancestors were called sun gods. Every tradition tells us that. So obviously somebody's plasma inhabited the suns. But the really big ancestors, they inhabited the dark stars. The big ancestors, the winged plasma ancestors, the Draco, they were inhabiting the dark stars. Well, the dark stars are the fact that you have the skill to embed your plasma in something so centripetal, it's so vast. Most of the local galaxies are held together by a dark star. Who's in there? Hello? Well, if you believe the movie or the television series Deep Space Nine, when you fall into the wormhole, which is the only way to make big money because that's the communication device, the black hole. When you fall into the wormhole, they found out that inside the vortex, the wormhole, the black hole, there is intent that if you're the bad guy, you get spit out. So the fact is, when you fall into these big black holes, only the pure intention survives. This is a big celestial memory, and I'm going to do a to be continued in the advanced class on ET origins on that question. But there is a big impact on our collective psyche about that break in the line. But I'm going to go on to the next question. Wayne, while in Vermont a few years ago, I built a house over a stream with curved walls and ceiling. I didn't have to sleep as much. My hair grew like crazy. I noticed fingernail and hair grows faster. People did not want to leave. I wish I had done this after learning about fractality. I went by instinct to feel. Was being over a stream good? It seemed blissful. Well, what they say in geobiology is, in general, sleeping over water is it's fun for a short term, but not good the long term. And the reason they say that is when you're over water, your aura will want to go with it. Now, if that water is going somewhere where your aura wants to be, into a nearby lake, and you can inhabit that field, cool. But if that water is going way off or into something that's not organic, your aura is going to be dissipating. How can you tell? Actually, in Stefan Cardino's instruction curriculum, you actually see they measure your aura when you walk over a water vein, and they measure your aura collapse a little bit. So actually, generally a good geobiologist will build certain walls of a house in such a way as to prevent people from sleeping over moving water. It's not always a bad thing. It's like, suppose you get a car full of children and you drive by a rushing stream, and just at that moment, half of them say, oh, I need to go pee now. What that is the water inside their body has just decided it found perfect distribution and it wants to go there. Okay, seems like there's variability living in the stream. I live on the one and the energy is not so good. Sure, there are other factors. Exactly. In fact, there was a school in Mullumbimby, the Waldorf school by the Steiner School in Mullumbimby. Unfortunately, it's located over a lot of underground water. And this presents certain challenges because if you're sitting over an underground water stream, your attention is naturally going to want to flow with that water, which means your attention is not going to stay in the child's classroom. So sitting over underground water would not be good for a child's classroom. And this, they found at this Waldorf school in Mullumbimby in Australia. Now, the deeper physics here is instructive as well, that you can actually measure the presence of deep underground water by measuring the efficiency of capacitive coupling, because the capacitive coupling is basically a phase conjugate phenomenon. So if you got two capacitors and you're measuring within a billionth of a percentage how efficiently they're communicating, and you walk over deep underground primary water, suddenly the capacitors sing together because the atmosphere is more conjugate and distributive. So there's technologies for actually measuring the presence of deep rock or primary water based on this physics. Okay, 11 minutes after 10. Any more questions? Yeah, that's the thing is to douse the building before the first survey. These were some slides about anti-gravity in the world grid, dodeca and the world grid. Let's just see which slides we missed here. This is about the cube of space being established by the galactic equator in relationship to the solar equator, and that this creates something called the erection of the Holy Cross. That although we think the photon cloud story was misunderstood, the fact is the galactic superwave story, Paul de Violette, does relate to this physics, which is that when the solar equator nutates, we have the Earth's equator nutate precess, then you have the solar equator nutate, then you have the galactic equator, and when they reach 90-degree relationship, called phase conjugate, you have the galactic superwave, which Paul de Violette says is increased dust within the solar system, and suggests that the anomalous radical increase in temperature on many of the planets in the solar system now correlates to this galactic superwave, which is the buildup of interstellar dust within the solar system, which relates to this alignment of galactic equator and solar equator, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something Nick Fiorenza called the erection of the Holy Cross, which is this sort of stellar re-arrival of the Christ story, that the large plasma beings achieve a different sort of embedding in the solar system when we align with the galactic equator. Now, this is, in the original slide, this is actually an animation of the Earth, solar, and stellar equators nutating and precessing. And you can actually see the animation of this in our in a slideshow. But it's difficult to put animations into Learn It Live because the bandwidth doesn't like it too much. But they're beautiful animations. And Nick Fiorenza is looking at the astrologic implications of this nutation precession, called erection of the Holy Cross. It relates directly to the fact that when you get lasers mixing at exactly 90 degrees, called four-wave mixing, you produce what's called phase conjugation. Lisa says, wonder if there were some factors not yet incorporated into biologic architecture. I think of how many temples and sacred sites have been all over the world. There seems to be additional factors in the quality of the energy. Well, remember you have the dodeca-ecosa Earth grid alignments, and then you have the local magnetic mapping and the underground water, the Cistercian concept, and then you have whether the temple is actually an implosive capacitor, the stupa concept, and then you have why the ancients called the pyramids the Hummer. If you read in the book, and I recommend it actually, it's the book is called Two-Thirds by David Myers and David Percy, and the website about that is goldenmean.info/Babylon, and you'll see what they call planet taming there. Planet taming, in terms of temple construction, has to do with the fact that you place the dolmen and the pyramids at tetrahedral latitudes. Let's see. Oh yes, the next slide. This is from that website. If you plant the dolmen at tetrahedral latitudes here, which is Cydonia on Mars and Giza on Earth, the tetrahedral latitudes allow the 7arrows.net principle of embedding in space, and this allows you to tune the spin rates of planets to phase embed zodiacal spins more accurately. And this embedding of planetary spin non-destructively within galactic spin, if you happen to understand the cause of gravity, hint, read my book, then you understand that this perfected golden ratio phase conjugate embedding, how tetracubes embed in dodeca-ecosa being the known symmetry of interstellar masses, and the dodeca metaphorically being the 12 houses. So dodeca-ecosa zodiacal symmetries properly embedded in tetracubic Earth grid symmetries, which are embedded with tetracubic latitudes of Cydonia and Giza, what this perfected embedding of localized spins in galactic spins does, called planet taming, is stabilizes gravity and therefore atmosphere. Because if you know what causes gravity, perfected phase conjugate embedding, you can stabilize gravity and therefore keep your atmosphere. This is not just a metaphor. This is what the whole book 2/3 was about, David Myers and David Percy. And actually, it's instructions 101 for planets like Earth that are losing their atmosphere. And if you happen to remember Mars, called Total Recall, it's about keeping your atmosphere, otherwise known as planet taming. So this physics of keeping gravity on your planet stable by keeping the phase conjugate relationship. And the actual, above here, this is a picture of the Tor in England, famous tower. There's a cone there. I can't remember now. And actually, this is what's a Hummer. And these are actually gravity motors. And gravity motors on a planetary scale for atmosphere maintenance. This is a serious conversation about atmosphere maintenance. Yeah, this is using fractality to predict the stock market. And yeah, this is rotation defines mass, rotation defines energy, symmetry of phase conjugation, and gravity maintenance. So that's what the rest of this conversation was about gravity maintenance and charge fusion, turning on DNA radio. You see where the conversation was going, that once you understand this concept of conjugate fractality, you can set up the architecture of living environments in such a way as to make sustainability possible. The book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy actually started with their relationship with Richard Hoagland, who was the guy who discovered about the tetrahedral latitudes on Cydonia and Mars, et cetera, et cetera. And then they had this sort of falling out at the UN, and David Myers and David Percy went their own way. And then Colette Dowell, who introduced me to that work, who wrote the Crop Circle Journal, et cetera. So she was involved with those boys, and that's how I came to meet them. So that's a little personal anecdote about the history of the discovery of planet taming. Okay, any more questions here? How DNA radio works, how DNA is self-awareness is made. Everywhere in these slides where you see soulinvitation.com / website, just change soulinvitation.com / goldenmean.info, and then you'll have the new web link. Yes, oh, here it's mentioning the fire crystal of Atlantis. That was something. So you see how the story of the Atlantean fire crystal is similar to that Koski-Frost crystal, which is a phase conjugate pump wave into a piezo crystal producing propulsion. And plasma propulsion is actually what temple construction was about. Now, you could say legitimately that, you know, here you're being too theoretical and we wanted to know how to build a church or how to build a sacred space. But we're giving you the background of the philosophy here, which is to say the pure principle of the electrical engineering. And the pure principle of the electrical engineering was that the magnetic field must look like a rose or conjugate, implosive or fractal, the capacitive field, the alignment of the magnetic lines of the area, and then the actual molecular geometry of the construction materials, all designed to create this implosion at the center, which makes the structure plasma compressing and therefore sacred space, the so-called place of power. So when you understand the core electrical engineering principle of what is a place of power or a sacred space, then you can answer your own questions in biologic architecture from pure principle, from inside the electrical engineering pure concept, hence a self-empowering curriculum. You could, for example, then make your own table of constructive materials, and you could then measure success when you're done by measuring, as we said, the capacitance, the seed germination, all from the point of view of pure principle, empowered architecture. To detect an arch, the perfect arch is actually the perfect recursion. This is our slide about phase conjugate dielectrics, about recursion in water, and the jitterbug and the cause of recursion. We have a website called Phi Recursion Induced Charge Acceleration Implosion Solution. We mentioned it recently on Facebook, goldenmean.info /phi recase. And basically, it's it's the precursor to the current book on origins of biologic negentropy, which describes the concept of that if you generate golden ratio recursion, you generate a charge acceleration implosion solution, which creates a path out of chaos for any wave system. That's what the fiery case was about. And eventually that became the new book, The Origin of Biologic Negentropy. And by the way, for those who have ordered the new book, the online version of the second edition of the new book with the 23 additional pages is now online, and those who have registered for this course have the link, the private link to the online complete color PDF of my new book, Origin of Biologic Negentropy, and the extended version is now the PDF that's online. It's about 64 megs. It's a bigger download. And the printed version of the new version of that book will begin shipping in approximately 2 weeks. It's on the way. And the Amazon version online is the new version as of a few days ago. So the second edition of the new book. And what the second edition of my new book, Origin of Biologic Negentropy, adds is very specific physics. Remember, we said my equation, Planck length and time times integer exponents of golden ratio predicts hydrogen radii, frequencies of photosynthesis, exactly the duration of Earth year and Venus year, and the frequencies of photosynthesis, et cetera, and even the frequencies of hydrogen. So we said that there was a whole list. Oh yes, I know, the harmonics of the Schumann resonance and the frequencies of brain waves of bliss. All that's simply that equation, Planck times golden ratio. Since that book was written, we discovered that the same equation predicts very accurately the frequencies of ADP, ATP, adenosine diphosphate triphosphate. The core of physics of cell metabolism is a phase conjugate collapse pump wave. And we discovered that it predicts the frequencies of the HRV, the LF and HF key frequencies of the HRV, the human heart rate variability, are specifically fit that equation of perfect implosive phase conjugate pump wave. Do you know what that means? That the human heart has naturally landed on the phonon recipe for implosive collapse, and that's called HFLF, healthy heart rate variability, which also we newly learned is the Meyer wave. So we have this whole list of new proof that the origin of biologic negentropy is pure phase conjugate implosive negentropic collapse based on that key frequency signature, which is on the cover. So we added all that new information to the new book, along with the work of Mark Rohrbaugh on the new equation of the ratio of hydrogen, ratio of proton to electron mass, because that equation proved the muonic hydrogen Schwarzschild proton dimension of Nassim Haramein, which fit then the golden ratio global scaling law from the Planck length, all the size of the universe, all based on golden ratio, which tends to prove the phase conjugate golden ratio theory of gravity. So all of that new information is in the new book with the new graphics and the new pictures, the new version, which is to say we've assembled all in one place all the evidence that golden ratio times Planck is the origin of all paths out of chaos. Imagine what we could do if we use that information. We could actually take things like, oh, the planet's ability to be self-regulating is limited by whether the Schumann harmonics are implosive phase conjugate pump wave. So we got the Schumann harmonics, and they're very close to implosive negentropic collapse. We could tune the planet to make it more negentropic, which is say, oh, we were worried that our climate was going to chaos. We are worried that our politics is going to chaos. We are worried that people are going into chaos. Oh, if we know the physics of the way in which wave systems emerge from chaos, we could do the same for planets and people. Wouldn't that be cool? It's simply a matter of tuning the frequency signature to better implode, which is exactly what we proved at Therify.net. Okay, I have carried on. I have worn out my voice. I'm going to drink more tea here. Any last questions, thoughts? Wayne says, thanks, Dan. I'm looking forward to remaining class so helpful in my project in many ways. Off for a walk in the woods, going to read the new edition. Yeah, thank you. You know, actually, when Jasmine showed that the ability to live without food depended on walking in the woods, what she meant was grounding. So I think that's good. Let's all go take a walk in the woods now. Thank you. So blessings, everyone. Thank you for coming. And pardon me for carrying on with more enthusiasm. Dominique, she says to take, oh, she wants a private message. Dominique says, oh, she's asking for my Skype. My Skype ID is not a secret. My Skype ID is Dan Winter. And I would be interested in doing your radio show. Probably. Let's stay tuned. You can reach me. Eden Grace, thank you for coming. Blessings, Eden. May you be in a Garden of Eden. Sweet dreams, everybody. Have a great night. So this film will become the lead introduction to the Biologic Architecture curriculum at goldenmean.info/architecture. And the next time this course is presented in 2 months, I will present more of the material from Ulrich Hosman, who has the very practical details in building the biologic architecture house, from the right insulator in the walls to the right slate in the foundation. Very practical information from Biologic Architecture 101. So to be continued. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. Sweet dreams. Bye-bye from South France.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Do you want to say something, Evans? Go ahead. Go ahead, Evans. Oh, yeah.
Yes. Would you like me to make a 5 minutes presentation?
Well, go. So, were you going to speak about the transformer design? What would you?
Yes. Explain the principle a bit. The principle of parametric amplification.
Well, sure. Why don't we there's only 2 or 3. Why don't you take 3 minutes and just introduce the idea? So what Evans is speaking about is implosionamp.com, which is our project with Chris. And, you know, when we're talking about charge implosion in a building, recursive amplification, there's something called parametric amplification, which relates to Caché's monoatomics. Go ahead, Evans, go ahead.
Do I have access? Can I show my screen?
Well, let me see. If I click,
that would be much easier.
So I have clicked to make you presenter now, Evan. So now you have presentation skills. See if you can do that.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Let's see. First, turn your camera on.
Oh, the camera on. Okay. Let me see.
Well,
What is it? Camera on. Okay. Allow. Perfect. Here it is. Medium quality. Let's say.
See that we were working with Caché on the cold plasma stuff, and they discovered the monoatomic coatings on the wire have a superconductive quality. There we can see your face now. Okay, so now I'm going to turn my camera off here. Or just go ahead. So now, I don't know if you have access to screen sharing.
Where would that be? Logout.
I think what we should do, Evans, let's schedule another.
Yes, it says, okay. Yeah.
Well, just try it. If you want to try an experiment, feel free to try it. I was going to say we can schedule that for next time and give you a better time window.
Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, why don't we'll plan another course. In fact, you know what? On 0-point vacuum coherence energies, we'll plan a more in-depth occasion, and you and I and Paul and Chris can have a more detailed conversation. So let's plan that.
Okay, sounds good.
In the meantime, people can look at implosionamp.com, and if they have questions, refer them to Evans. And let's say we're definitely going to plan a future presentation on vacuum coherence with Evans. Thank you, Evans. Blessings. But since it's after 10:30, I think we'll say goodnight. My throat's getting tired. But to be continued, Evans. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
You're very welcome. See you next time, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.